Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our June 3rd Thursday, Writing About the Body. My name is Sam Babyak, and I'm the Program Director for the Writers League of Texas, and I'll be moderating tonight's conversation. Before we get started, though, I want to take a moment to introduce our panelists for the night. Up first, we have Cameron Deason-Hammond. Cameron Deason-Hammond is the author of This Is My Body, a memoir of religious and romantic obsession, the Nonfiction Discovery Prize winner for the 2019 Writers League of Texas Book Awards. This Is My Body also earned a bronze medal in the 2020 Independent Publisher Book Awards in Creative Nonfiction, was named a finalist for the 2019 Forward Indie Book of the Year Award in Autobiography and Memoir, one of 5 great indie press books from 2019, Book Riot, one of the Rumpus's best books of 2019, and recommended by Brene Brown in her 2019 roundup of Fall Book Love. Kirk has called This Is My Body a generous and unflinchingly brave memoir about faith, feminism, and freedom. Since earning her MFA from Seattle Pacific University, Cameron has taught or lectured on creative writing at Writers in the Schools Houston, Imprint Houston, Hugo House, the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, Duke Divinity, and Lone Star College, Kingwood. She is at work on an essay collection about complicated love. Thank you, Cameron, for being here. Next up, we have Natalie Lima. Natalie Lima is a Cuban Puerto Rican writer and a graduate of the MFA program in Creative Nonfiction at the University of Arizona. Her essays and fiction have been published or are forthcoming in Long Reads, Guernica, Brevity, The Offing, Catapult, Sex and the Single Girl, Body Language, and elsewhere. Her writing has been honored in Best Small Fictions and noted twice in Best American Essays. She has received fellowships from PEN America Emerging Voices, Tin House, the Vona Voices Workshop, the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing, and a residency from Hedgebrook. Natalie is currently working on a collection of essays. You can find her on Instagram and Twitter at Natalie Lima09. Thank you, Natalie, for being here. Next up, Deborah Deep-Mouton is an internationally known writer, educator, activist, performer, and poet laureate emeritus of Houston, Texas. Formerly ranked the #2 best female performance poet in the world, her work has appeared in Houston Noir by Akashic Press, Black Girl Magic by Haymarket Books, and the Texas Observer and Fjords Journal, and on such platforms as NPR, BBC, ABC, Apple News, Blavity, Upworthy, and across the TEDx circuit. She has served as a contributing writer to Texas Monthly and Glamour magazine, heralded as a literary genius by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee in 2019, Deep's most recent poetry collection, Newsworthy, garnered a Pushcart nomination and was named a finalist for the 2019 Writers League of Texas Book Award, and an honorable mention for the Summer Lee Book Prize. A German translation under the title Bergsinswort, I don't think I said that right, is set to be released in fall 2021 by Elif Verlag. Most recently, she performed as a part of the Kennedy Center's Arts Across America virtual performance. Thank you, Deborah, for being here. And last but not least, we have Lisa Olstein. Lisa Olstein is the author of 4 books of poetry, most recently Late Empire, and a book-length lyric essay, Pain Studies. A member of the poetry faculty at the University of Texas at Austin, her work has been recognized with the Guggenheim Fellowship, Lannan Writing Residency, Pushcart Prize, and Hayden Carruth Award, among others. Thank you, Lisa, for being here. Okay, so I wanted to start this panel off by just reading 2 quotes to y'all to get us thinking about writing in our bodies. And the first is, "The call to write is a call that's received in the body first. If we are to answer this call, we have to feel every part of our lives." That's from John Lee, writing from the body. And lastly, "The sensations of my own body may be the only subject on which I'm qualified to claim expertise. Sad and terrible then, how little I know." Okay, so I'm so excited that you're all here, and I'm so excited for this conversation. And I'd like to start by asking each of you just to talk a little bit about how you conceptualize the relationship between your writing and your body, or the body in general. Cameron, I'll start with you.
Oh, good, lucky me. I get to go first. Wow, well, I think of myself as being someone who struggles to be embodied, and I'm much more comfortable in my head. I think primarily as a writer of spiritual memoir, I'm always trying to find a way to incarnate the things that are essentially unprovable about experience, and spiritual experience always falls in that realm. I mean, so does love, right? And so does kind of all of our emotions. So I try to remember that I have a body more often than not. And when I have remembered that I have a body, I feel as though I have succeeded. I think physical pain, and I know we're going to talk about this later, and changes to the physical body kind of force that. And so those have been interesting seasons, of my life, the way that it's affected my writing. It's really something I think we'll talk about later. But that's, I don't know. I hope that makes sense and is coherent. But that's kind of what I think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for saying that, because I think that's something that is really hard for a lot of us. It's actually just being embodied and being in tune with our bodies. And we'll talk about that later for sure. Natalie, what about you?
Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. I felt like I should have been prepared to answer this very basic question. After hearing Cameron's response, I actually feel like I've always been reminded of being in my body because I've always lived as a big person. And because of that, growing up, I felt incessantly reminded of it. And so I think part of coming of age for me was a lot of trying to ignore it. And then later, once I started writing, it feeling like the one thing I wanted to write about was just living in it, sex and the body and things like that. And so, yeah, that's, I guess I see it as less of like a not real thing and more of like, oh no, this is a constant reminder here. And instead of letting other people sort of kind of decide the narrative they create with my body, that I can talk about it and write about it in a way that feels honest and true.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Deborah, what about you?
Yeah, I think I have like 7 answers to this question, so I'm going to kind of limit it down to one of them. I think very much is like Natalie was saying, like being a person who is a more curvaceous woman, right? A little extra. I think I've always been aware. I think I've always been aware of myself because I'm a Black woman, and that always means that I have to be aware of who I am all the time in my own body. And I think also, like thinking about even like psychological studies that they've said, like you hold trauma in your DNA, you hold the way you react in your DNA, your anxiety is held in your DNA. I think in those ways, because our body and our emotions are so just immediately entangled with each other, for me, the writing, if it is emotional, if it is visceral, if it's entangled anyway in how I feel, it has to stem through my body, right? Like it has to be connected to my senses. And I think my work is always geared towards really heavy imagery because of that. So I think for me, that's kind of how I see them lining up is, this really kind of clear stopping in moments and really living and looking around. I catch myself in really important moments, like looking around and thinking about like, what does it smell like right now? What do I feel against my skin? Like that's how I take in the world. And so I think it's only natural that it be the way that my work comes out as well.
Yes, and I love that. And I think as writers, part of our job is to create a bodily or felt response in our readers. And that comes from putting bodily responses and emotions on the page as well. So Lisa, what's your take on your relationship between your writing and your body?
I'm really fascinated, by the answers so far and by this sort of duality of sort of we write out from our bodies, but also we write sort of as bodies that are observed by the world, right? But I connected most to that first quote you pulled to start this question, and it reminded me of something that I heard the late great Grace Paley say once, which is that it starts as a pressure in the chest. And I definitely feel that sense of an embodied urgency that often feels like a pressure or like a mounting form of energy, and that's usually the first phase or aspect of writing energy for me. And then it also feels very tied to the body in that it all happens in the ear for me. I hear a phrase or I hear a tone, I hear a rhythm. So that's mostly in the ear, but it's also in the mouth. It's in the body. I think like a giant dork, I sway around when I'm composing, probably. I definitely read aloud. So there's the internal ear, but then there's the external ear as well. So I think that it's a place of embodiment for me, but not because I know my body so well, but because my body is one of the tools that engages with language to make discoveries, to investigate. And that's what sort of energizes me. And of course, the mind is involved, but the mind is inseparable from the body, and they intersect or come together in language. So they're sort of inseparable, certainly in that way for me. And then there's the way that, language has its own body. We inherit these words and we shape them, but they have their own physicality, they're visual, they're oral, they have these histories that are really complicated. So of course they live in the mind, but they feel like a very physical medium to me, despite that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. So I think you've all sort of touched on this a little bit already. And so before we dive into our bodies like on the inside, I want to stay on the outside, because our bodies, and when we're writing bodies, they don't live in a vacuum. And there are so many things and structures that we must consider when we're writing about the body. And a lot of this has to do with the idea of perception, which I think that we've talked about already. So I'm wondering how the idea of perception, whether it's being perceived or you perceiving other people perceiving your body, like there's so many ways we could go at this, but how does that play into your writing of the body? And Deborah, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's funny because for so long in the beginning of my kind of writing career, I refused to write about race. And part of that was because, I thought about it as like, I'm a larger Black woman, when my hair is out, I'm usually wearing afro, right? Like I look like I smell like incense. I don't, but I look like I do. Like I just have this kind of, it's easy to perceive that everything that comes out of my mouth would have to be racially stimulated. And because of that, I just avoided it entirely, right? My stories were my stories, and they were inherently Black because I was, but they didn't go out of their way to try to complicate with commentary on race or things like that. And I found that quickly that became more exhausting than just fully living as my whole self. And so now I think when I come into a space, it's not that everything has to be a statement as a Black woman or that it always has to center in race, but I'm wildly aware that anything that I do will be seen in that lens, despite whether I write it in that vein or not. Someone is going to add that layer to my work. And I think knowing that about my body and knowing that about the way that I'm perceived and knowing that those layers are there, I'm much more intentional about certain things in the work because I know that they're not going to be able to be detached from who people see when I show up for a reading, right? And I think it's just really important to think about what are the liberties and the restrictions that our bodies hold for us when we come to the page. I see this a lot in writers who are writing stories that are not of, their kind of like experience, and they're living in another body and trying to write from it. And a lot of them lately, right, have been getting called out and getting in trouble because there's something that's disingenuous to some people. I'm on the fence of saying, like, I think that you can have creativity that doesn't just have to look like you, but I do think that you have to be aware that there's a certain perception of you, a certain understanding of who you are in your statement. And because of what the body is that you live in, you have a certain responsibility when you come to the work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deborah. Cameron, I'll come to you now. And I want to read a line from your book back to you, because you say, my female body was an issue, would always be an issue. And this was something that within the church and being on stage and backstage and everything that you were experiencing in that time of your life, you were really reckoning with the way that your body and you as a person were being perceived. So I'm wondering how that idea went into your writing of your book.
When Natalie said earlier, this she said, and I'm going to paraphrase you incorrectly, but the idea that your body will be commented on, your body will be discussed, and so the opportunity to create the record, right? The opportunity to be the one creating the writing about the body, that was a huge motivator for me in writing my memoir and writing the book that I wrote, because I was, you know, in an environment, in a religious community that believed that women, by virtue of being in female bodies, could not lead, right? And or should not lead. And I entered into that community of my own will. I wasn't born into it. I was raised like a super liberal Jewish New Yorker, and chose through various circumstances to become a part of an evangelical subculture. And my femaleness was a barrier to being able to participate in leadership and decision making, and, you know, the things that I felt I should be participating in. So, you know, I thought that, you know, addressing the body that I presented through the writing would create a record, you know, and gave me an opportunity to, you know, sort of in flesh, for lack of a better metaphor, my experience of being in that environment for as long as I did, you know, I stayed as long as I did. So yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Natalie, I'm going to come to you now. And you have this great paragraph in one of your essays, and it starts with, what's great about relocation is that everyone in the new place is unfamiliar with your body. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and this idea of perception, but also just like what it's been like for you to write these essays and like move through the world as you're thinking about perception as well.
Sure. Also, I just want to say I feel lucky to be on this panel with such accomplished people, and yeah, I feel, you know, lucky to be in conversation with y'all tonight. Yeah, that's from an essay I wrote about different elements, but essentially about being in a body. And I moved across the country. And there's something about when I'm moving into a new space where folks don't know me already, I feel like there has to be part of my body feels like an introduction to that space. I feel like people will have certain perceptions of me, maybe surprised that I'm confident, or maybe, you know, one way or another that they expect me to be or would rather that I be. I also write about seeing somebody who I haven't seen in like a year and a half after putting on a large amount of weight, and seeing sort of like shock on their face. And so that also being a reintroduction sometimes, as somebody whose weight fluctuates. And so I'm just interested in being able to write about that narrative that so often I feel like we're supposed to be a bit quiet about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Lisa, what about you? You had a whole chapter on perception and being perceived and perceiving. So what do you think?
I'm curious if you want to ask more about perception. It seems like the question you're asking now is mostly about like our being perceived in the world, by the world. And the book that I wrote that I think is most explicitly about the body was a book that looked through the prism, sort of through the lens of my chronic migraine condition. And so I think in terms of perception, I started that book because in many ways, I realized I had somewhat of an internal taboo. And part of that, I think, was self-protection and was coping. But part of it was I didn't want to stop passing. I didn't want to, in that sense, out myself as having a chronic and invisible disability, and what that would mean for my sense of self in the world, what it would mean for friends or colleagues or whomever. And I think that if I recognize that I have an internalized taboo, I'm interested in sort of probing it The only other one that I can identify was I had a similar thing about writing, incorporating the experience of becoming a mother into my poems. And it was sort of the moment that I realized I had really kind of built this wall, this protective wall around that. But I thought, well, that must be fucked up in some way. So I think I better explore that a little bit. And I think that there was some of that energy that I felt on an internal level, maybe ready finally to be interested in looking at this thing that I myself needed to turn away from as much as possible. But I also was interested in outing this part of my experience, which was so central to me, but which had not played a role in my work. And that was a wrestling with how would I be perceived and how would it be altered, and what are the privileges and burdens of the possibility of passing, right? Because obviously passing is not always available in all kinds of ways. And so there's, I think, a ton of gender, a ton of misogyny, sexism in the moment, internalized, but also the history of all of those things. So, migraine is something that has a very gendered history, and like a lot of other things like hysteria, was often considered to be a woman's problem for a lot of womanly reasons.
Thank you, Lisa. And so we're talking about our bodies and the things that we feel. And Lisa, your book is a study on pain. And so I think these ideas, like things like pain and fear and grief, we all feel them, and they are essential to our experiences and to our writing. But they can, like, we hear this all the time, like there are no words. But as writers, it's our job to find the words. And so I'm wondering how you approach writing things that you feel in your body that there aren't really words for, and what writers should be doing or thinking about when they're trying to capture these untranslatable experiences or feelings. And Lisa, I can stick with you for this.
Sure, thanks. I love this question. I mean, we don't say this about love, but it's as profound, as complicated, as ineffable. We tend to say this about grief, trauma, and pain. And of course, I relate to that. But I'm also really deeply in love with language. And I'm one of those people who doesn't feel like there's a paucity of it. I feel like there's a flood of it, a wealth of it. And so in doing this work, a lot of it is about similes and metaphors and associations. I was really interested in delving into the words and language of other people, into archival sources, and other kinds of things as well. But I also became really interested in, are we letting ourselves off the hook by saying pain is untranslatable? Pain is the place where language falls away and fails us. And one great example that I delved into a little bit in the process of writing the book was Virginia Woolf's sort of seminal essay on being ill. And she starts off by declaring, in the face of pain, language dries up, turns to dust, and abandons us. And then she goes on to write the most exquisite, enveloping description of pain and illness. And it's like we feel obliged to say, oh, we couldn't possibly use language for this. We can't translate it. And it's like, well, why not? Language is one of our primary tools for empathy. And I think we shouldn't let ourselves off the hook in terms of gaining the ability to use it when facing these universal elements, no matter how particular our specifics: pain, grief, loss, illness. These things are ultimately universal. And so I think I think it's more like we don't want to hear it rather than we can't say it.
Thank you, Lisa. Natalie, what do you think?
Will you repeat the question again?
Yeah, of course. So I was talking about how there are things that we feel in our bodies and that we experience, like grief and pain and fear. And Lisa added love to that, which I love that. And so I'm wondering, how do you approach writing things that you feel in your body that there really aren't words for? It's hard for us to find words for. And what should writers be doing or thinking about when they're trying to capture these experiences on the page?
Yeah, I loved what Lisa said about how sometimes we think pain is untranslatable. Um, and, I too agree that it's not, that we should be able to write about all these feelings. And it made me think about how if the subject matter that I'm writing about, with one of these heavy topics, it feels too heavy, that maybe I'm not ready to write about it if I can't find the language for it, especially if it's tied into some kind of trauma I've had. Then I feel like it just needs a bit more space to brew. And so once I feel ready to write about it, I feel like finding the language feels easier and yeah, and more approachable for me.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. And I think that's something really important to remember, that when we are writing, our body is giving us cues about the things that we're writing as well. And sometimes our bodies are telling us that we're not ready to write about something. And that's definitely something that we should be thinking about. Deborah, what do you think?
It's funny, I was gonna say a similar statement. I like to remind people that you have to live the life before you could write about it. Like there's seasons to what you're doing, and sometimes it really is just like living the life that you will write about later. And giving it kind of that breath. I often imagine in my head, because I'm that visual person that like always has to have an image to go with everything, almost like a big giant measuring cup, like the old ones that people like, when you really bake hard and you like have this huge measuring cup. And in my mind, it's kind of like as the feelings come, they're filling that cup up. And when it gets to a point that it can overflow, then the language will come to meet it there, right? But sometimes you just need to take more time and allow that cup to fill. And I found myself even recently, like in a situation where I was kind of forced to write about something that I wasn't ready to deal with. And there's extenuating factors at times that make us, write things quicker than we're maybe ready for. I would also say just be willing to write things over a million times. I often find that when I'm really wrestling with something, it'll show up in my work over and over and over and over again until I feel like I've said it the way that it needed to be said. And so just giving yourself the ability to kind of write that same story 7,000 times until you feel like it's written the right way.
Thank you, Deborah. Cameron.
Yeah, I mean, kind of what I was starting to say earlier, this idea of, this is so important for spiritual writing because it's easier to understand why it's ineffable. Like love, we expect to be able to have language for love, but a spiritual experience is even more kind of removed from what we regularly will talk about. And so with my students, I actually, because of Jessica Wilbanks, who someone mentioned earlier, is teaching a class for you guys. She turned me on to a poem when I first started teaching spiritual memoir by Nick Flynn. It's called Cathedral of Salt. And he talks about, how to name the ineffable. He says, it's like poking a river with a stick, better to write about the river or the stick, which is sort of also the same idea as, the no ideas, but in things, right? So finding the rivers and the sticks and the things that can give a corporeal or a physical representation of, is so critical when trying to write about the ineffable. And I think that idea that we've talked about already about time, like when we're talking then about how do we give language to the pain, the painful mysteries of the body or of the self. I mean, this is such an important thing, this time idea, right? Because we live in, this faster, like, formulated into a post for Instagram. You're in the ER and you've got to write a beautiful, eloquent paragraph about what's happening to you in the ER, and it's just like, holy shit, like how are we processing and giving, giving space to these experiences that we're having when we have all essentially become like little publicists for ourselves, on this wheel of churning out content all the time. And I think that's just such an important thing to think about and talk about. And as writers and as teachers of writing, to give our students the permission to take the time that is required. I think good writing takes time, and I don't want to hear that because I'm, like everybody else, I've got 15,000 things to do. But but it's always better when I've written it 7,000 times, as Deborah said. It's always better when I've revised and revised and revised and become a little bit less, idiotic, a little bit less reactionary in the way that I communicate it. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. So I want to talk a little bit about research now. So I want to bring up that Ulysses quote that I read at the beginning, because I think it gets at something just really important. And it's, the sensations of my own body may be the only subject on which I'm qualified to claim expertise. Sad and terrible then, how little I know. And so I actually found this quote and this essay through reading your book, Lisa, because you talk about the unknown world of the body. So I'm wondering, when do you think it's necessary to conduct research, and how do you find the right balance between research and your own lived experiences?
You're asking me, right? Okay, for now. I think it depends so much on considerations of genre and audience and what your aim is, what you're writing. And I think there are responsibilities and opportunities and sometimes obligations that come with different territories. For my particular lyric essay, I did not feel like I wanted to undertake a project that would bring to bear the responsibilities of the historian or the anthropologist, or even honestly, the journalist in terms of fact checking. I knew that I wanted that project to be from a deeply personal place, even though I was going to be doing a lot of very idiosyncratic research. And I knew that for that piece of work, I wanted that research to be driven by what I sort of felt like was the opposite of obligation, but instead by fascination. And in part, that was because, who wouldn't want to have the chance to do that? That feels great. But also because I was trying to create a mimetic experience of how the mind, or at least my mind, sometimes moves in migraine. So I was trying to kind of delve into the kinds of sources or stories or little obsessions that I experienced during a certain kind of neurological phase of migraine, where I'll get super obsessed with underlying every utterance that Joan of Arc makes in the unbelievably long transcript of her trial. And it's like, they're very few and far between, but for a period of time that like obsesses my mind. And so I wanted to go into sources that I felt that way about, and I wanted to kind of make manifest what I call migraine mind, which is these strange obsessions where all of a sudden things come into kind of like hyper focus, and I'll go really deep down a rabbit hole or a well, and then I'll ricochet off to something else. So in this particular book, I was really mindful of wanting to go outward and use sources, which is always kind of a form of research, but that I wanted to give myself the freedom to do it really idiosyncratically. If I was writing a cultural history of women and migraine, or writing a companion piece that was going to be in Harper's or whatever, and have it be fact checked all to hell, it would have been a very different work. So I think you've got to kind of know what you're aiming for, and what responsibilities you bear as a result. I felt my biggest responsibility was to try and be interesting.
That's a great point. I feel like we all feel like that. That's great. Deborah, what about you? How much research goes into your work, and how do you balance research and your lived experiences?
Yeah, I think my lived experiences are research personally. I don't find this like really clear line between them. And I understand that, certain genres of writing lean heavier to like kind of that fact check, type research. But my mind works in a way that automatically connects it. And, like Google is research. I don't know. It is, right? So it might be something where I'm sitting and I'm thinking of a metaphor and I'm like, it's like a reptile. I need a reptile. What's a reptile that lives in the Amazon? Like, right. And then I'm on my phone and immediately I'm down a rabbit hole of like reptiles, right? And looking at all their nuances just to fulfill a metaphor that I needed, and I think, so for me, it's always really present in my work that you may never know that I did research to back it up, but I've done the due diligence of it, with Newsworthy, because it centers so much around like specific events in time and history that happened. I didn't want it to be this retelling of all of the moments of those things that happened between the police and Black bodies. I wanted it to be about my body wherever I was at the time these incidents happening, fully understanding what it was to live in that moment full out and on. There had to be some research just in like making sure that I got the person's name right, and the place that it was, because when there is such a litany of bodies, sometimes it's hard to remember who died where. And so like those kind of fact check things definitely played into the work of just making sure that I was putting things in the right context. But, I really do find myself always picking up a book or always trying to connect really random facts into the work. And so it doesn't really work as clearly divided as maybe it does for some other people.
Yeah, I love that. Natalie, what about you?
Yeah, I'm always thinking about this. It's always on my mind, maybe because I recently finished an MFA nonfiction. And this is a conversation that we hear a lot. There's this sort of like the memoir heavy writer versus the folks who seem to enjoy writing more researched work. And I kind of find myself in the middle. I like both. And so even the essay collection I'm working on right now, it has a mix of both. And I think, though I feel like I prefer writing more of the memoir heavy essays, I think that when I do write things that have research in them, I like what Lisa had said too, again, that it needs to be about fascination instead of obligation. So I think I can underestimate myself as a writer and tell myself that maybe I'm not smart enough to write on this topic, and why am I even researching it because I don't know enough about it. But I think if you're obsessed with something that maybe nobody else knows about and you're teaching them, you can make them easily obsessed too. And so I think that whenever I'm writing anything researched, it has to be something that really excites me. And so I have this essay online in Catapult that's about men with big women fetishes who solicit me online to do weird kinky stuff with them. But then the other essay is about fat women in art history and pop culture, the other part of it. And I was like, I had such a blast writing that because I knew nothing about the topic really. And then I got to like dig in and learn about this new thing. And suddenly it felt less intimidating. So that's what I tell other, emerging writers who maybe feel a little bit intimidated by research, is that like we are smart enough, and just pick things that really interest you and excite you.
Thank you, Natalie. Cameron, anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I think, I love this conversation, and I wish we were like in person and we could like have the banter, going even more kind of naturally. But I think that I felt that pressure, like what you were talking about, Natalie, like that I'm not smart enough to write, I heavily researched. Like I really struggle with that when I was doing my MFA. I mean, trying to figure out how to keep the seamlessness of the voice when introducing, research into a personal essay, for example. With my book, I didn't do a lot. That was not the aim, right? The aim was memoir, but there are moments in the book that needed to be sort of undergirded with research. And that was fine for the book. But I've actually strangely found so much excitement and joy in the writing I'm doing now that is much more heavily researched, right? This idea of like following the obsession or following the fascination. And then thinking like, the things that you find, like, for example, I became obsessed by Southern resident orcas, right? As you do. And the things that you find, these resonant facts about a killer whale that, I would have never thought would emulate or parallel or be a great metaphor for my physical experience as a woman in a female body, right? And it's exciting. It's just like, it's fun, and it can be fun. Writing can be fun. It's also a lot of work. But that's for me the fun part these days is the research.
Yeah. Thank you. So Natalie, I'm going to come back to you for this next question. And I think we've all sort of touched, or you've all sort of touched on the vulnerability and the difficulty of like being in your body and putting that on the page. And then once it is out on the page and in the world, how do you deal with, you know, having your body and your experiences on the page in these vulnerable ways? And why do you choose to tell your stories in like nonfiction and essays?
I love this question. So I started as a fiction writer, and it was when I had my first big essay published that my writing started getting attention. And the essay was about living in a fat body. And so I thought that it was something that maybe other like fat women could relate to, and that would be that. But then I got, you know, responses and notes from so many people, men, and people in all kinds of bodies. And so I realized that it's a topic that we're all thinking about. You know, I think it was silly of me to think, oh, no one could relate to this, you know, and dealing with sort of how other people, dealing with it being out in the world. Once I feel like you start doing it and it starts getting published, I kind of stop worrying about it so much. So I mean, it helps that my family, they're not like really readers or anything. So it's not like they're all reading my stuff, thank God. But but once I started having things out there, and I'm like, okay, so people are learning all these very personal things about me, and that's that. Like, what are they going to do with it? They can't really hold it against me, you know, or it's not like they can, now that it's out there, it's not something they can like throw in my face, is how I feel. And so that doesn't feel so challenging anymore, thankfully. And I write a lot about sex and my body, but the essay that I had the most trouble having out was an essay about, an essay I had published in Guernica last year about my father's affair with the next door neighbor when I was growing up. And I couldn't write that until I was in my mid 30s, you know? And that essay I thought would be like, oh, I couldn't handle having this out in the world. And then I would get responses from people saying things like, you know, I'm so glad you wrote this essay. I'm the child of a mistress, or my father was a philanderer too, and all this stuff. And so it was like this thing to me that literally it was like my deepest shame. And no longer, I feel nothing about it anymore now. When it comes up or I think about it, it's like, oh, it's a thing that happened and that's it. And it's so, I think it was like moments like that that make me realize the importance of writing our stories, especially if we think that they're embarrassing or if we're holding shame around them. They help people. And I know that sounds super cheesy, but it's why I'm like always going to be a lover of creative nonfiction, you know, and why I think it's so important to write about our lives, especially if you live in any kind of marginalized body or grew up in any kind of marginalized community. Yeah, so.
Thank you, Natalie. And it's not cheesy, it's so, so true. Deborah, what about you?
Yeah, you know, my background is a little different in that I didn't come to writing on the page first, if that makes sense. Like I didn't come to publishing first. I came to performing first. And so in the performance poetry world, you know, like one of the critiques is that it is you trauma porn, you know, like at times, right? It is this overwhelmingly like a little too free with our information, our stories. We live a little bit too much in our traumas. That's an accurate critique. And I think I got to the point where I you know, had to realize the times I was oversharing for other people's comfort, but for my own, I was immediately kind of being raised, or like I say raised that way, right? Growing up kind of in that community, it was always a thing where, you know, people were sharing these really intimate details about their lives, and then they would come off stage and they would fall into someone's arms and we would weep together, right? Like we'd create these really emotionally and sometimes codependent bonds. And like then from that we would, you know, that's how we created friendships, that's how we created family. And so I think now when I come to the page, I'm still carrying a lot of that with me of understanding that there's that kind of catharsis when people read the work and when people connect. And I think just like Natalie said, as more people start to respond to you and start to say like, this is my story too, and I was scared to say it. And you start to like really like dismantle that shame and that fear, you then want to do it more often, right? Like, because you realize it really is a freedom, not only for yourself, but for so many people, held up in just like the first person saying it was me first, And I think that that's kind of, for me, like how I let go is any moment that I'm like, I don't know if I should write about this. I miscarried a child and I was like, should I be saying this out loud? And then I realized how many people were quietly suffering, holding that and not feeling like anyone saw them or anyone understood them. And the moment I said it, there was this outpouring of women who were like, I've had a miscarriage and I needed someone to say that. It's happy to know I'm not alone, I think that kind of community that we build with our words, right? Like it's like an ecology of words, right? Like we like start to build this whole new system and how we can operate and move with each other. Like that's what brings me back to keep doing it over and over again.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And that kind of reminded me of, I think it's a Maya Angelou quote, and it's like, there's no greater pain in the world than having an untold story inside of you. And I just love that. Lisa, what about you?
Yeah, I love what Deborah and Natalie have said on this. I think that there can be a cliche around catharsis, and to me, it relates like going to a alternative medicine practitioner who sort of said like, you just need to find a way to express yourself and then your migraines will resolve. Or the idea that the experience and the arc of creating art is itself so transformative that it will provide catharsis and resolution and healing. And I don't mean to belittle aspects of transformativeness around art, but also I call bullshit. Like that is so easy for the inflictors of harm to say, right? Or even more subtly than that, our culture, which wants to deny trauma of all kind, deny illness, disability. It's like, isn't it pretty to think so that if you just write about it, well, it'll somehow become resolved. And so I wrestled with that because I knew that writing about my migraines finally and sort of coming out about living with a chronic pain condition, it wasn't going to cure me. And there was no resolution. And I didn't want to create a false arc of resolution. But I also did find that I relate to it differently. And I think it relates to some of the things that other folks have said, which is I'm not hiding a part of my experience anymore. And that feels different. It doesn't change that I live with that experience. So yeah, that's how I'll answer that one. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Cameron?
Sorry, unmute. Yeah, so I think if I can reiterate kind of the question, I think why maybe I got this wrong. So tell me if I did, but sort of like, how do you navigate the vulnerability sort of inherent in writing about your body, right? And so why choose, for me, nonfiction? Why not choose fiction, a medium that I could at least distance myself from what I'm writing about, with that. And I think that for me, I mean, this is a question that, kind of how do you negotiate your family members and your friends, right? And how people react to that essay that you publish or whatever. And I talk about that so much with my students, or the students that come to me for creative writing, like are so, often so interested in this question of like, how do we navigate what we're, the vulnerability that we're putting out there? And, and I mean, I really have tricked myself. Like I have spent a great deal of energy tricking myself into, the whole process of writing the book that I wrote that, people don't read, no one's going to read that. No one's going to buy this. I'm never going to sell it. I'm never going to agent. No one will ever read it, and like, that was what I had to tell myself in order to be as transparent and honest on the page as I knew I had to be for it to not be shit. If I was apologizing for it or making it pretty in any way, it wouldn't have been worth the vulnerability to me to put it out there, right? And I was kind of pleasantly surprised that I found like fewer people at least felt the need to talk to me about it. I don't know that they read it or didn't read it, but like Natalie was saying, like her family's not big readers. Like part of my family read it and like had the expected response. And then the side of my family I was worried about, nothing, And I was like, great, cool. I mean, there's so many other things people can be doing other than reading books, and they often choose to do those other things, So, but I think that for me, the word that comes to mind is exorcism, not to be too dramatic, but that kind of exorcism of working out the fear in the reveal is happening in the drafts. It's happening in the process of writing. And but by the time it's out there, like I think Natalie also mentioned this, like I've moved on. I'm a different version of myself than I was when I was wrestling with this material on, on the page. And I feel like that's a great gift, and I don't know if everyone experiences that or if you all also experience that, but it's almost like by the time someone wants to talk about it, I'm kind of like, oh, what, like I'm, and I want to talk about it, but I'm not the same person I was, when I wrote that. So.
Thank you, Cameron. That's a great point. Okay, so I want to talk about the body as a setting for a moment, because I think when we're talking about writing and storytelling, we need tension and we need conflict. And I think that there's this inherent tension in the fact that we live in these bodies that can break. And so I'm wondering, how do you explore this inherent tension in your body, in your work? And why do you think it's important that we do so? And sort of like, what are the ways that your body can add to the conflict or the tension in whether it's a story or a poem or an essay? And Deborah, I will start with you because I think there is so much, especially in newsworthy, like we're going into this knowing that it is about police brutality and being Black in America. And so there is this very obvious tension from the very start that there is this danger there. But can you talk a little bit about how you navigated that?
Absolutely. I think for me, my body only knows how to live in that kind of tension. And that is not of like necessarily my own design, right? Whether that was growing up and understanding poverty or whether that was navigating external dangers. I think that specifically as a Black woman, we know fight and flight better than anyone, right? I'll put that out there. That's how I feel. You can disagree with me. I think that for us, moments of peace are harder to find. Moments of joy are ones that have to be intentional. And so to come into a work like this, it's really less about how do you maintain the conflict or how do you draw upon it, and more about how do you narrow in on one of the many conflicts that you are constantly under. And I think in Newsworthy specifically, that's what I wanted to do, was to narrow in on just the conflict of what it is to want to justify to yourself that your woman body will get you out of being murdered by the police, right? And maybe that it'll only be a threat to your children or to your brother or to your uncles or maybe even your father, but like that there is something about being woman that will save you, only to find out, that that's not even a thing, that it'll just make you lost and not talked about instead of lost and, front page of the news. And so for me, that's kind of where I landed with it in that specific work, is just really like, I think every one of my pieces narrows in on one of the many intersections of conflict. And I think all of us hold many, many conflicts, right? In my upcoming book, Black Chameleon, it's definitely much more about like myself as a Black and woman. And even thinking through like, how does that define me differently than white and woman? How does that define me differently than girl, right? What is my difference as a woman versus how I was when I was a young child? And so I think that when we really pay attention to it, we are a series of crossroads. And at any one of those moments, we have a million stories that we could really tell if we wanted to, if we really like are willing to slow down and pay attention to what are all the things that are at odds at any given moment of our lives. Did that answer your question? I have no idea if that answered your question.
That was incredible. Thank you, Deborah. Lisa, what do you think?
I think for me, tension and like I'm feeling very much yes to what Deborah just said. Like we are the sort of crossroads, we are the cross currents, like all things meet in us, right? And collide and then kind of move back out. And I think that like another valence to the question is, to me, like tension is synonymous in writing with urgency and with stakes. If you don't feel some urgency, some idea of stakes, and I don't mean it has to be check any particular boxes emotionally or culturally or experientially, but that feeling, that pressure in the chest feeling, like there's got to be something at stake. And I think tension is one aspect of that. And then it's about exploring it and inhabiting it honestly and through your medium. So for me, again, as I'm a poet and I write sort of lyric essay, which has a lot of poetic freedoms. And so to me, one of the things that feels essential is, why am I writing? Why is this a poem? If I already know what I think, if I already know what I want to say, why wouldn't I just write an opinion piece? And great opinion pieces are essential and can be amazing. But if I'm writing a poem, my commitment is to engaging with language as a medium. And the tension and the urgency is something that I want the medium to be an active collaborator at the very least in. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Lisa. Cameron, what about you?
Sorry. Yeah, I just, yes, hooray and amen to everything that's been said. Like, if there are no what is it? No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. I mean, I feel that way about stakes, like if I'm not afraid of this in some way, if there isn't that pressure, that taboo, I think Lisa mentioned earlier, right? If there isn't some sort of taboo in this for me, then if it's not a high wire act in some way, then it's not worth doing, or I'm not interested in it enough. And I feel like after what Lisa just said, I finally understand why I'm such crap at writing op-eds. Like I cannot write an opinion piece to save my life. Probably because the motivation for me in essay writing is as a vehicle for exploring something without arriving at an answer. And that tension is exciting and propulsive to me and keeps me interested in work that I enjoy reading, which is true of everyone on this panel's work. So, yeah.
Thank you, Cameron. Natalie?
Those are all so brilliant. Everything everyone said is so brilliant. And I'm sort of like, what do I want to add to this? I just feel like if we're talking about, because I feel like there's this conversation of like tension in the writing and then the actual tension of like living through things and then writing about them. And I think that tension and storytelling is number one for me. I'm also a fiction writer. And so to me, a story with high stakes is like the most important thing to me when I'm writing nonfiction, which maybe is to my own detriment, but I have, therapy and recovery program and the whole shebang. So, I feel like it's, for me, it's all about the narrative. There's a tension of growing up as a girl in America. That's always something worth writing about. And I think it's something being written about much more so these days in ways that I find really fascinating and honest. Growing up, myself with a single mom. And, I lived in an all Latino community and went to an all Latino high school. And so, I have an essay coming out in an anthology next year called Sex and the Single Girl. So it's about like experiences dating, but my whole essay is about abortion and consent. So I think it's like the darkest essay in the book. But, I write in the essay about you spend your entire girlhood dodging dicks left and right. And literally that's what girlhood feels like for me, at least when I was growing up. And so writing about that tension feels important, and it feels like something we're talking about now more so. And writing about the woman's body in particular feels like something that's in the forefront and super exciting. And so, yeah, I feel like there's an inherent tension in all our writing as women, and any kind of marginalized folks.
Thank you, Natalie. Okay, so this is going to be our last panel discussion question before we move into the Q&A. So to our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please add them to the Q&A now, and we'll get to as many as possible soon. So I want to leave folks with some tangible advice for tapping into their bodies, because I think, our bodies in ways are like their own thing. They hunger and they have needs. And Cameron, I think you do this several times in your book. You talk about your body knowing things before you did. And the thing is, the thing that can be hard is that we don't always know how to listen to our bodies. We don't know how to translate what our bodies are telling us sometimes. So what are some tips or tricks or exercises that you've picked up along the way that allow you to safely and effectively tap into your bodies and then write about it? So I can start with Deborah, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, I'm gonna push back and say, like, I think we always have known how to tap into our bodies. Like, I think it is the work that we do to quiet that, especially as women, right? We quiet our guts. We say, oh, that feeling was wrong, and I'm gonna talk myself out of it. And then we realize we were right all along, and then we're angry at ourselves, right? We're resentful. We didn't listen to ourselves in the first place. I think, like, growing up, especially in the society that we grew up in, we have learned how to turn it off. And so for me, a lot of it has been just like really journaling helps, right? Like thinking about, what am I really thinking about? What are the things, that gut feelings that I had? What are the things that I long for and desire for, even if it's just like lemon cream, lemon bars on a Sunday afternoon? Like what are the things that I crave and want and need to feel wholly myself? There was a question, I'm like briefly gonna like tag on it because it just kind of comes in here, that was put in the chat, that was like, how do you bring healing into your body, especially as a BIPOC writer? And I think for me, it's like, that's where my healing is, right? It's like when I start to see myself and acknowledge myself, when you put the light back on yourself and say, like, the things that I believe and want are valuable and necessary, and find a way to celebrate those in the writing and in your own lives. Like, I think that's when you start tapping into things that are wildly authentic. And while, like, I agree with Lisa, it's not always going to change things, right? To know how clearly your body needs something, or the limitations of your own body. There is something in acknowledging it and accepting it in the ways that we like cycle through grief, right? Of getting to that point of acceptance, which most people know grief doesn't work linearly, right? Like, we come to acceptance and then we move back to anger, right? Like, we're going to jump around it a million times, but it is these kind of small moments of acceptance that we can start to verbalize and really start to speak then from, I think, once we're really listening to ourselves.
Thank you, Deborah. Cameron?
Yeah, just so like from the writing perspective, I always, when I give my students writing prompts, I always give them timed writing prompts. And when I'm stuck, I do this to myself. I always ask, what does it feel like? What does it smell like? What does it look like? What does it sound like? Because just those questions, when, we're writing a writing prompt for 10 minutes, drops us into our bodies. And that question of how to give words to the ineffable is kind of quickly addressed when we're talking about smell and taste and touch. And so just writing through the senses is a way that I deal with that.
Thank you, Cameron. Natalie?
Can you rephrase the question again or repeat it?
Yes. Sorry, one second, my chat's in the way. So I'm just asking, what are some tips or tricks or exercises that you use to safely and effectively be in touch with your body and then turn around and write about the things that you're feeling?
Okay, yeah. Oh, I love this. And I saw one of the questions in the chat that someone wrote was, do you have any writing prompts on the body that help you get started? And I have a couple that actually were big for me. for writing a couple of essays. One of the essays I wrote started at a reading I went to, and the writer, my friend Catherine Standifer, she gave us a prompt at the reading, which was to write about a part of your body that you dislike. And then that turned into a whole essay. So I think that's always a powerful move. And another one, write about something, we're writing Flash, right? Flash fiction or CNF. Write about something ugly and make it beautiful. Something I like to teach when I teach CNF is writing a letter to your younger self. And I think that's an easy space to write about our perceptions of our body growing up, in particular, if that's something challenging or something we've been wanting to tackle. I use Cheryl Strayed's Tiny Beautiful Things column as a model for that. So I think that there are gentle ways that we can approach hopping into something that might feel a bit inundating on the page. And I think it also helps to feel like you're in a space where you can be open and free, and a non-judgmental space to, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Natalie. And Lisa, what about you?
I think that one of the things that develops over time is balancing sort of abandon and rigor. So you learn to trust your boldness. You learn to how to like douse for water, you know, like what is a fascination, and what is how do I tap into a vein that actually is going to be rich? And I think you develop a sense for what has resonance, for what has that sort of magnetic pull. And I think some of that, and then you balance that willingness to trust those things and to trust experimenting with them, knowing it feels like the stakes are so high. It's okay to fail. It's okay to think that something has that pull and that energy, and then to write into it and realize it doesn't. It's probably going to lead you to something else. Most of the time it does, but it's okay to abandon stuff too. So there's like be adventurous and learn over time. You're sort of a fluency with the kinds of signals that your own process will reveal to you, but it can't reveal until you engage with it. And that process is going to involve patience. It's going to involve failure, patience, trusting that you can set something aside and you might not pick it up for 3 years. But that's one process as well. In terms of prompts and stuff, people have so many different feelings, and there's so many great resources out there. I think one thing I would say is, and if you like prompts, if they're fruitful for you, like do them, try them all. If they're not, I think, because some people kind of are allergic to them, it's okay to imitate. And it's even interesting. I mean, maybe less so for fiction, although I would guess this too, certainly in poetry. I've learned so much by simply transcribing a poem that I admire, because the syntax, the line breaks, to embody that practice, I'll watch my own mind skip to the more normative phrasing, and then I'll have to correct it and be like, no, that part of what makes this poem so magical is it didn't go into a normative use of syntax here. So you can find ways to really metabolize work that you admire, as well as sort of use prompts as leaping off points. But I think it's about recognizing that over time, you'll learn your own, you'll become fluent in your own habits and resonances.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. That is it for our panel discussion. I could talk to you guys for hours and hours, but we're going to move into our Q&A session now. So to our audience, please add any questions that you might have to the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as possible. Okay, so first question, Lorna is asking, can you please talk about how to authentically write about our fictional characters' bodily sensations and reactions without being cliche or shallow? And Deborah, I see you nodding your head, so if you want to take a go at this.
Yeah, I think that cliche is easy, and I think that you can start there. And that sounds like, why would I start there? It's cliche, but I like to really like flip cliches. So even as simple as, like it's raining cats and then changing dogs to something else, right? Like taking what we expect and shifting that. I think in the same ways, butterflies in my and put it somewhere beside your stomach. Like those subtle changes in like literal cliches help us start to think about what are other ways that we can go about describing things. I think also, like there is something that's very cliche about love and about what we feel when we feel it. And I think that sometimes it's less about the feeling being cliche and the more about the writing being genius. So I think if you can lean into familiar feelings, but describe them in ways that are new, that for me is going to be like a more interesting to read as a reader. And some of that, like some of the activities I do for that is I may think, okay, I'm going to describe love. Let me list everything that I think of when I think of love. And then I cross all that out and I'm not allowed to use any of those words. Right. Just really like reorienting myself to say, like, I'm going to use brand new language to describe this, and forcing myself into that usually helps me a lot in kind of developing characters that are both authentic in emotion, but or maybe new in language.
Thank you, Deborah. Does anyone else have anything to add? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I would add just a tiny bit, like you are what you eat kind of thing. If you are reading a wide range of aesthetics, a wide range of perspectives, and you're learning to read like a writer. So you're maybe just going along and experiencing it as a reader first, but then you spend the time to really try and like metabolize, how is this sentence or this line made? On a technical level, recognizing again that language is literally your medium, it's your paint. If you're a dancer, it's your body and the choreography of the dance. And to start relating to the medium in that way, you'll learn by everything you read, and you'll be able to see pretty quickly, like, oh, the story here is gripping, but there's nothing that interesting in the music here, or the sound, or the imagery. And then you'll find work that does both things, right? And that will light up your brain, and it becomes your frame of reference in a very real way over time.
Thank you.
Can I piggyback off that for Lisa? Like, I completely agree with you. I also think it's really important for us to read things that are beyond what we would normally pick up. And so even if it's just going to like a half price books and just grabbing a random book that's in the the nonfiction section and reading it, there is something about giving yourself a breath of language too that really helps.
Thank you. Okay, next question. This is pretty interesting. I think we could take a go at it. So Heidi Kwok is wondering, as an all-female panel, do you feel men have a hard time writing about their bodies? Anyone want to take this on? Cameron, maybe?
I mean, I don't really read men. I'll be honest, to be totally honest. I don't. And maybe because I'm trying to understand myself in a body marked female in this world that's not built for women, so I don't really feel like the time I spend reading, I'm very rarely reading men. I'd love to know of examples of writing by men that does do that well.
I would suggest reading by Marlon James. Like, I think Marlon James does a really great job of really living in his body and talking about it really honestly and being able to have great conversations in ways that maybe some others don't. I mean, I speak more from the poetry side, though I do write a lot of other things. I think Terrence Hayes, I think Jericho Brown, like I think where I start to find men that are able to connect with their bodies, that they have an intersection with some other space of being marginalized. So they're people of color, or they're queer, or like they find themselves lying under multiple labels, and those things almost help usher them into the conversation around their bodies a little bit easier.
I think Easy Coats is great too. Natalie?
I just wanted to add, yes, to all of this. I'm like, oh, I don't read that many men either. So I laughed really hard there. But yeah, the intersection of the men who write about their body and having some other marginalized identities seems to be 100% true from what I noticed too. It's always you know, POC or queer men. And I have a friend who has an anthology that just came out or is about to come out called Fat and Queer. Bruce Owens Grimm is his name, and he's doing it with somebody, co-editing it with somebody else. And so that one has, you know, it's all folks writing about the body, and all queer folks. And so I'm really excited for that anthology. But yeah, I certainly am always excited to read when men, you know, do write about their bodies too.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. That is it for tonight. But please, we're going to put the Book People link in the chat box so you can support an indie bookstore and support our panelists tonight. Thank you all so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to get to talk to you.
Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for being such a great moderator, Sam. It's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, you were great. Thank you.
It's
Have a
great
great
to talk to you all. Thank you.
It's good to meet all of you too, by the way.
night.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.